Hello, everyone. I'm Joe Hernandez, and I'll be the facilitator for this workshop, which is the value of floodplain restoration at the local level. This will be presented by Dr. Emily Pindilli, who is the Director of Science and Decisions Center and economist at the U.S. Geological Survey in Reston, Virginia. Being an expert on environmental and informational economics, her and her team provide insight to a variety of different environmental and economic issues across the state, such as harmful algal blooms, sustainable irrigation, and flood mitigation. I'm really excited for this presentation. So without further ado, Dr. Emily Pindilli.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. And so thank you. I'm going to talk about some ongoing research that we have at USGS. And I want to start by noting that while I'm presenting this, there are a whole lot of different scientists who are involved in this research at different levels, physical scientists as well as economists. And you'll see a picture of them at the end, but even that is just a small subset of the team. And I'm going to focus in on the Chesapeake Bay and Delaware River watersheds, where we've been doing stream and floodplain ecosystem services. Great, so first I want to talk about why we started this project, and it actually started back in 2015. And at the time, there was some emphasis on ecosystem services in the federal government, and essentially there was a bunch of funding, and we were able to get some of that funding. So that's where this started. But it's gone from sort of this federal level set of research to much more stakeholder driven and local level set of research. And we started this work in the Chesapeake Bay, where restoration and protection are an important priority for stakeholders. And at the same time, there's a lot of development pressure in the lands that are conserving and providing water quality benefits. And so one of the other issues, for those of you that have heard of ecosystem services, is they're usually something that should be looked at the local scale, but they're not typically done within political boundaries. They're usually on, HUC 12 or something like that. And so we wanted to focus on where could decisions be made with this intersection with ecosystem services. And so our goal was to look at streams and floodplains at a scale that was useful for decision making. And I'll talk a lot about the methods development itself in a very small watershed in Virginia called Difficult Run. But that basically provided the beginnings for then looking more widely at Chesapeake Bay. And then we've transferred a lot of those different techniques to the Delaware River watershed. And a lot of this is going to be applicable, in New Jersey, in other parts of the Northeast, and around the country. So for those of you not familiar with ecosystem services, they're very simply the benefits that nature provides to humans. It's very human-centric, focused on things that the ecosystem does in terms of functions that can then be translated to something that's of value to humans. And from an economist's perspective, we usually talk about value as dollars, not necessarily things that are goods and services provided just in markets, but those things that people have a preference for. So you may want to go fishing, and so you're willing to pay to go fishing, or you spend your opportunity cost to go fishing versus doing something else, like going bowling. So there's many ways that we can look at value that doesn't have a cost in a market, but something that we can actually put a monetary value on. There's other types of social science approaches to looking at value, but I'm going to come from that monetary standpoint. What this figure is showing you are these sort of traditional set of ecosystem services categories. So things like provisioning, timber comes from the land, it's something you can cut and use. Regulating surfaces are things like regulation for climate change or reducing fire, and that has to do with the ecosystem quality and how those are being provided. Cultural services includes a lot of things on recreation, which is more commonly looked at, and then there's other things like the spiritual values that one might have for different types of ecosystems. and then supporting services, which are often considered sort of an intermediate service like soil generation, things that lead to a final ecosystem service. And then talking about what's an ecosystem service assessment. So there's a lot of these out there. Some of them will look just at biophysical endpoints. What is the ecosystem providing that humans might want? But a truly integrated project that allows for valuation is going to be starting with an interdisciplinary team and looking at final ecosystem services and goods. And in this type of process, we want to look at quantity, quality, and value of ecosystem services. And it's essentially looking in inventory. And in this case, it's most useful when you do that on a map. So you may be able to use that for targeting conservation or targeting restoration. And you do this to understand what the environment's doing. It's an important tool for communicating why are we conserving something or why are we restoring something, and also understanding trade-offs. So where you may develop, for instance, houses in a floodplain, it's important to understand what you lose versus just the land itself. And so most of the methods are integrated, ecologic, economic, and also very much GIS based. So this is a framework for ecosystem services valuation. And what you're seeing here is the ecosystem is in that black circle. Things like water, soil, atmosphere, and those functions are sort of all inherent in that black circle. And there's a lot of different inputs on the system, and you may or may not be considering those when doing an ecosystem service assessment. But the whole goal is to understand the system so that you can then understand, well, if you make a management action, how does that influence the ecosystem? You may have your business as usual case as you look out into the future, but then you could add different climate change scenarios on it. And then you look at how that ecosystem flows through to these different green boxes. First, you've got your ecological benefits. So for example, if we look at flood protection, the ecosystem may reduce flooding. So when we're talking about floodplains, that's a really important one. The service itself is reduced number or magnitude of floods, and the beneficiaries are going to be people that live there. And you've got these different categories in this framework. And so the reason I'm talking about this today is, how does this inform decisions on conservation and restoration? And one of the important things is you've got these different types of physical benefits, but it's hard to look at that bundle of goods that are really diverse. So when you value them, you're able to have a single metric, which in this case is dollars, that allows you to aggregate. And I think this has come a long way, but early on, many scientists were very worried about putting a value on different types of benefits of nature. But essentially, it's not dollar in the sense of a market, but what are people's preferences and how are those expressed? And it does allow for looking at, again, a diverse set of things in one framework. And so this can help you look at the benefits against the costs. So you may have an opportunity cost of conservation. For example, maybe it was a productive agricultural field that you made fallow, and you can look at the things, again, weighed against each other. And then also realized costs of conservation. A lot of different restoration costs can be very high. So not only looking at what's the benefit of that restoration, but also in some places you might get better return on investment. So that's something that, we think this can really support decision making. And then again, mapping benefits across the watershed can really help look at, well, where's your highest value? In this case of floodplains or other restoration. So one of the things that this has been looked at as stream bank restoration. So where are you going to get the biggest bang for your buck? That's kind of the purpose of doing this ecosystem services study. And then, we narrowed in for this project on floodplains, and some might ask, why do we care so much about floodplains? But they're essentially the intersection of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems and a biogeochemical hotspot for nutrient processing. And so I'll talk about those a little bit more. And there really is limited information. So in the literature, as well as for decision makers who are looking at floodplains. So there are a whole huge menu of different ecosystem services that one could look at when considering floodplains. We wanted to essentially look at those things that may be of highest value and also that are feasible to look at both physically and economically. And so floodplains have a high capacity to retain sediment, nutrients, and floodwaters. And those are really critical both locally and then downstream as well. So in this case, we studied, and I'll talk about nutrient and sediment retention, flood attenuation, and carbon sequestration. And for this project, I'll talk a little bit about the physical science. Any questions that are too detailed, I'll have to refer you to my colleagues. But I'll talk a little bit about that and then more about the economics of it. But essentially, it started with LIDAR mapping of the floodplain. And essentially, that's much higher level geospatial data than is typically used. It's better than your Landsat 30-meter data. And it's looking at assessing the floodplains in more detail than you may see like FEMA 100-year floodplains, which are very different from what was ultimately found in this study. So that mapping using geospatial coverage of the entire Chesapeake Bay at this point, and it's almost complete for the Delaware River watershed, was then combined with stream and floodplain physical characteristics. So those are actual field studies, which I'll talk about a little bit, where some of that nutrient retention in the field is measured. And then the next step was to say, okay, if we look at these field measurements and LIDAR data, can we come up with something that we can extrapolate to the whole system? And then we correlate those ecologic functions with ecosystem goods and services. So if we talk about nutrients, it's what's happening on the floodplain, extrapolated over the system. And then what does that do for humans? And so, probably pretty familiar, as you retain nutrients downstream, that improves water quality, could lead to better recreation, better catch of crabs and fish and water clarity and many other end benefits. And then we're looking at the value of those ecosystem services. And again, ultimately the goal is to scale up for this. So I mentioned Difficult Run. This is a watershed in Virginia, 150 square kilometers, and it includes Fairfax County, so some pretty heavily used urban areas, but it's still largely forested, 33% forested, and only 15% developed. And for those familiar with the area, it's Great Falls National Park is right there in the watershed. So there's a mix of different uses. And so you can see here on the map, all of the streams and these red stars are field sites. That's, again, where the scientists went out and did actual measurements. And the focus there was to look at nutrient retention. And so here they're looking at things like bank erosion. So they've got pins that they're measuring how much of the bank essentially is being washed away. They've got some floodplain pads that's looking at elevation. And I think I'll talk more about how they did nutrients in just a little bit. But then, so the LIDAR mapping that I mentioned, again, is a very good geospatial data set. And what you see here is mapping of the floodplain itself. So all of those little dots along where the floodplain is. And so this is 3-meter elevation, essentially, a DEM, compared to what you would usually see as 30 meter. And then ultimately it gives the floodplain area and stream network cross sections and bank points. Let's see. And then channel metrics that I mentioned are things like what's the bank height, bank width, bank full area, a whole bunch of physical characteristics. So all of these things that I mentioned here are actually measured at those field sites. And then they came up with a way to correlate to LIDAR so that it could be extrapolated across the whole area. And here you're seeing these little hashes. That's the whole floodplain. So now to get into more detail about sediment and nutrient retention, this is kind of a logic diagram of how the ecosystem provides a function that then leads to a human benefit. So you've got a floodplain that retains sediment and nutrients. So essentially this is a balancing act. Erosion takes away sediment and nutrients, and then the vegetation as well as the elevation both provide a function that retains more than is being washed away. But that does vary from place to place, and it depends on a lot of factors. And that's one of the reasons it's so important that this is looked at across the whole watershed. And so what happens there is you've got loads of sediment and nutrients that are reduced. So then into the stream itself, going down here, we were really concerned with Chesapeake Bay. So as it moves downstream, are you reducing that load of sediment and nutrients? And one of the important things is improved water quality. There's a picture there of a Secchi disc and how well can you see into the water. And ultimately the service to humans there is, are you able to view the environment? You may swim, wade, or boat, catch fish. Those are the types of things that people value at the endpoint. And so I mentioned sediment balance, and essentially this is a measurement. You've got upland erosion and delivery. So this is the bank coming down into the floodplain itself, which is that lower elevation. And then all of that sediment's being deposited on the floodplain, again, depending on those qualities. And I've got a picture there from one of the scientists on the team, Greg Noe, showing, this is basically a picture of sediment that's being deposited on the floodplain. And then essentially you're going to net out that bank erosion to see what's the load in the stream. And so here are field estimates of sediment flux, essentially finding that large streams had more deposition and the small streams had more bank erosion. So what you're finding here is some of the areas of floodplains, you've got positive deposition. So the net balance in this case would be good. And the smaller streams, there was more erosion. And I won't get into a lot of detail on this, but most of these things that I'll present do have publications. So if there's anything you're interested in learning more about, I can refer you to publications as well as the specific researchers that worked on any pieces of this. And then again, I've mentioned this linking the field to the entire watershed, and they developed regression models to look at sediment flux, bank sediment flux. And they also have similar models for nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon. And when it came to ecosystem services, we really focused on that sediment and nitrogen. And so here, this is difficult run the entire thing. And ultimately, the physical output for floodplain deposition was 19,500 tons per year. So, to put that in context, it's enough sediment to fill 8 Olympic swimming pools every year. And so this is just deposition. So next you would have to net out that erosion. Here for the entire floodplain, there's 23,200 tons a year that are eroded. And that's something really to consider, how much erosion is happening, or should you maybe do stream bank restoration. And so again, looking at that upland delivery, deposition, and ultimately it netted out to be negative. So there's about 8,000 tons per year less going into the stream. And then we've got nitrogen. So you've got about 70 tons less of nitrogen going into the stream due to floodplains. So now that we have that physical metric, we wanted to look more at what's the actual value of that. So starting with lower nutrient and sediment load. So I just mentioned those characteristics, which then leads to improved water quality, those opportunities for viewing and recreation. And then again, so our goal here is, as economists, we call willingness to pay for recreation. So willingness to pay is essentially a measure of what your preferences would be, how much happiness essentially you would get from doing an activity. And it's not always possible to look at what we would call like a gold standard. In this case, the gold standard would be willingness to pay. There may be a proxy or second best approach. So here we ultimately used replacement cost of wastewater treatment, which I'll talk about a little bit. So I mentioned that the best approach is measuring consumer surplus. And so again, that's willingness to pay. And unfortunately, it was not possible with the amount of time that we had and the information available to do that. So we used that next best approach, replacement cost method. And essentially, we're looking at, so if you had a built alternative to a floodplain for that same function, so wastewater treatment plant in this case, what would the cost be? And there's some requirements. You can't just say anytime, if it costs you $5 to get rid of a ton of nitrogen, that's how much it's worth in every case. That wouldn't be an appropriate transfer. It needs to be essentially the same service. So you have to be getting rid of the same amount of nitrogen in this case. It needs to be least cost. So there's much higher cost. And as you remove more and more nitrogen, you have to go to these, more complex technologies that cost more. So you'd want to focus on that least cost alternative. And you also need to show that demand exists. So in the Chesapeake, we felt comfortable doing that with the total maximum daily load decision that, yes, this is policy. We are removing a certain amount of nitrogen. So therefore, we can go ahead and use that replacement cost method. So, this has a calculation, which isn't really all that important, but essentially showing that we're substituting the wastewater treatment costs for that same function, which is getting rid of nutrients and sediment. So in difficult run again, there's one wastewater treatment facility that services the area. It's located in Washington, D.C., the Blue Plains wastewater treatment facility. And we were able to get detailed information on the cost there. So their enhanced nitrogen removal system was $1 billion to install. And so what we found was that using, again, that least cost, so going in concentration from 14 milligrams per liter of nitrogen to 7.5 milligrams per liter, has this cost of $11,500 per ton. And so ultimately, this service was $5.75 per pound of nitrogen removed. And so we were able to use that information to say, if you had to instead have this built environment versus the floodplain, this is what the cost would be. And so I mentioned that costs can change dramatically. So you go from $5.75 a pound up to $115 a pound as that technology gets higher and you're removing more and more concentration. But again, the most appropriate would be the least cost alternative. And so now the next service that we focused on was flood attenuation, or basically the bathtub effect of a floodplain. Floodplains store water during precipitation events, and that can reduce the peak in the stream, and ultimately it's hopefully going to reduce adjacent community flooding. So in terms of floodplains, the way that we evaluated this ecosystem service was to look at the natural floodplain. So what is the storage of the floodplain currently? And then we developed a counterfactual, and we said, okay, now you have no floodplain, essentially, you've paved over it, and you're losing two things. You're losing that dip in elevation, which acts as a bathtub, and you're also losing the vegetation, which is really critical for slowing the rate of water that goes into the stream. So here what you're seeing is two different DEMs or cross-section. The one on top is the actual natural floodplain, and you can see there's lots of bumps. And that big dip there at about 200 is the stream itself. And then the one at the bottom is, again, where we've paved over that floodplain. So USGS had a toolkit that we used, which incorporates, again, what I mentioned, that vegetation, which reduces velocity of water. And we were able to put in the two different DEMs, the one with the floodplain and the one without. And that gives us the inundation depth. So what you see here, if you can see that dark blue line in the middle, again, that's the stream. And then the floodplain is the larger blue area, so where the water is going to fill. And then finally, we wanted to look at, okay, if you have that function of the ecosystem and you have attenuation of floodwaters, then how do we value that? So we're looking at essentially, does it reduce cost to human buildings, essentially? So this is fairly common, this last component. FEMA has a tool called HAZIS, which you can look at flooding at different levels. And we're just taking it to a different step with a little bit more discrete data and looking at properties a little bit more in detail. So again, we look at estimate inundation for both the baseline, that's with the floodplain, and then the counterfactual scenarios. And what you're seeing here, all of those green dots are properties. So one thing that's good about Difficult Run is that development was done smartly. It's not always the case. Houses were not built in the floodplain, which is a good thing. And there's a pretty steep toe slope, they call. So basically the slope at the end of the floodplain is fairly steep. So it takes a lot of water to get into those homes. And what you're seeing here then is these greenhouses, like in the red square, in this counterfactual scenario, are actually being flooded. So most of the houses are not being flooded, but the ones that are, what you can see here then, we're associating with damages. So if there's how much water depth, associating water depth with damages. So like this house had 6 feet of water, and so it's 35% damage. And then we use property values to come up with the actual number. So in the baseline with the floodplain, at this level, there's $323,000 of damages during a flooding event. And in the counterfactual, there's $425,000. So we're able to net those out to come up with a value of flood inundation. So here are all of the parcels with their properties under both counterfactual, again, without the floodplain, and then the baseline. And ultimately, we modeled different storm recurrences, the 2, 5, 10, 25, 50, and 100-year storm recurrences to come up with a single value for that one. And I didn't have the value there. Okay. And then the final service that we looked at is carbon sequestration. And floodplains store a lot of carbon in the soil and in biomass, which ultimately lowers carbon input to the atmosphere. Reduced atmospheric carbon can have an impact on climate change. And so this one, we don't have any field data that went into it, but essentially looking at the different types of pools of carbon across the total inputs, total emissions equal the system flux. So essentially from literature, looking at things like above ground biomass, trees, the soil actually produces a lot more of the carbon sequestration than above ground. And so all of that was used from literature. You can see here different amounts of carbon sequestered in litter fall. So it changes in the different geographic areas. Okay, so this one, I apologize if I'm repeating, is showing from floodplain retention of carbon. Then we looked at the social cost of carbon So what are the benefits of reducing 1 atmospheric ton of carbon dioxide? And then we used the Interagency Working Group on Social Cost of Greenhouse Gases value of carbon. So it's currently for 2020 about $51, reducing a ton of CO2. And so that's a pretty simple way to apply what we call benefits transfer, that value to carbon sequestration of the floodplain. So then the goal of this project is to essentially add everything up. And so what I'm showing here is the Floodplain Ecosystem Service Mapper. And this is a product that's online now. It doesn't have everything, but as soon as we have data, we're trying to update it. And what you're seeing is the outline of the Chesapeake Bay. This also has the outline of the Delaware River watershed. And those red dots are field data. And so at the time, what you can do is click on those field sites and see all kinds of detailed information. But ultimately, the goal is to include all of those economic values and to essentially show, again, across this whole thing, where are floodplains that are higher value, lower value, might be more or less important for conserving, or might provide more or less opportunity for restoration. And I just want to mention, for those of you interested in ecosystem services, coming up in just about a month, a community on ecosystem services is hosting a virtual event, and that's free, but does require registration. And next December, we're hoping to be back in person, but it's a real opportunity for practitioners and physical scientists, as well as economists, to all come together and to talk about ecosystem services and how they can be used to inform decision making. Just a plug for that. And I mentioned early on, I was going to show a picture of our team there in a difficult run, getting ready to measure some things. And for us economists, it was a lot of fun because we don't get out very much. But again, there's even a larger team than this. There's a whole lot of science that went into all of this work. And that is my last slide. So I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
All righty. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. That was incredibly informative. So I've definitely learned a lot about ecosystem services, which was very cool. So for everyone, with the time that we have, which I think will go up to 11:20, which we'll have this time for questions. So if you'd like to put any questions, you could put that in the chat. I'd had a couple questions, or quite a few, if you'd like to answer those for me. How much time did it take to do the full analysis or the study for the single watershed of like difficult run, and how would you would compare that to like another ecosystem or watershed?
Well, so difficult run was about 3 years, and some of that was, there was more methods development. So doing it again would definitely not take that long, but it would take no less than 1 to 2 years, and there that also has to do with they need a summer season for field data to collect the new data. So I think one of the ultimate goals is using that data to learn how to do the field to LIDAR connection more quickly. So the work in Delaware has really benefited from the work in difficult run in Chesapeake, and so has been done much more quickly than that.
Cool. Thank you. So we have a question from Laura here. Can you describe again the range of cost equivalents of nitrogen removed? Do you know of utilities that are more apt to pay for sediment removal or nitrogen?
Yep, let me flip through. So this chart is specific to that Blue Point wastewater treatment facility, where it ranged from $575 up to $115 for those different concentration levels of removing nitrogen. But it can cost a lot more than that. So like best management practices in cities have been quoted at $400 and $500, much more than this. And then using agricultural best management practices can be a lot lower. So those are tending to be around the $5 to $15 range to remove a pound of nitrogen. And the second part of the question, I'm trying to, so is the question either or to pay for sediment or nitrogen, or I'm not sure I understand the question.
If you'd like to put a follow-up, Laura, that would be great so that we can understand the question better. If not, we can get back to that. Oh, okay. What do you use the cost for?
Okay, so for this case, we used the cost, we used a cost replacement method. So we said, okay, at that lowest cost alternative, $575, is how much we valued every pound of nitrogen that the floodplain essentially retained. So again, that's the net balance of nitrogen from coming in that was retained and netting out the amount that was eroded downstream from the floodplain. So looking at essentially what's that natural system providing that you would otherwise have to pay at, in this case, a wastewater treatment facility to do.
Awesome. We have another question from Ryan. Do you plan on expanding this work to more Delaware River tributaries? What sort of preliminary work goes into assessing the high versus low value of these systems?
Yep. So we started working on the Delaware River watershed probably 3 years ago, and that one's been a little bit bumpy. We haven't had funding every year to keep continuing on it, but we are working on that area and just starting in this coming year to work on flood attenuation, looking at that hopefully for the entire watershed. And looking at the values, so this it sort of depends, but usually an ecosystem service approach will prioritize some of those services in conjunction with stakeholders. So looking at what's going to be the most valuable. And for instance, we thought off the bat here it's probably going to be nutrient retention and flood attenuation. And there are a lot of other types of services that we weren't able to get after, things like recreation in the floodplain itself. And then looking at actual costs when you're doing this type of a cost approach, it really is very dependent. So we were able to work directly with this wastewater treatment facility and get real costs. There are some data sets on wastewater treatment facilities across the entire Chesapeake Bay that EPA has collected, which are somewhat out of date, but those are public information as well. So some of that data is not too difficult to collect.
Awesome. Next question is from Dean. For estimation and valuation of the numerous ecosystem services, how standardized are they currently? Is a more master database repository growing and used across practitioners?
Yep, thank you. That's a great question. The methods are not really standardized. There are, a fair amount of agreement on basically like what are the gold standard. There continues to be some disagreement on things like surveying people and asking them, what they're willing to pay versus a lot of the approaches, what we call revealed approach, where somebody, for instance, will go fishing and we look at how much do they pay to travel there. So revealed versus stated approaches. There are some good databases. So USGS is part of hosting one called Benefit Transfer Toolkit, which has hundreds of different studies, and you can look at different parts of the country. I think the most values that are out there are really recreation based, things like mule deer hunting. Fishing is really well studied, and I think water quality is one of those that's still coming up. But the benefit transfer toolkit's a great place to look for, does this part of the country and does this service that I'm interested in have good literature and some good values.
Awesome. I'm going to pull from one of my questions. Let's see. I think there's a couple questions that I was going to ask that others asked, so that was great. Kind of along the lines of like resources. Do you think you can the provider for the mapper that you have for ecosystem services, is that readily available for people to use? And would you be willing to like possibly send a link for that in the chat here?
Yeah, I can send the link for that. Yeah, that's Chrissy Hopkins, a physical scientist, developed that, and that's available. That's public now. And again, we're trying to update that as more of the pieces essentially get populated. But yes, I will add that link, and I can add some links to papers as well.
Okay, cool. So I know you were talking about the willingness to pay approach for water quality, and that you didn't get the chance to do that because of time. Do you think you will ever go back to take a look at that as approach more?
I don't think for this system. We're currently doing in the Chesapeake an unrelated study that's not looking at floodplains alone, but we're looking at recreational fishing, and we've developed a survey that gets after those willingness to pay questions. One of the challenges we have mostly as government is we have to go through this long process as part of the Paperwork Reduction Act. So it takes about a year to get a survey approved. So that's 1 year that you can't do anything, and then there's a lot of costs associated with getting a survey out there and collecting the data. So it's a much longer. We usually say it's like 100 to 200K to do a survey before you get any of the results. So I don't think we would be probably focused on any of this, but we're trying to identify areas where there isn't specific data. So for instance, like I mentioned, right now we're looking in the Susquehanna River at smallmouth bass and trying to understand sort of local fishing, where the Chesapeake Bay, the main stem is there's tons of data out there, and there have been a lot of studies looking at willingness to pay to fish, and if you catch one more fish, how much better off are you essentially, or what would you be willing to pay for one more fish? So we're trying to find where would it be important to do that kind of thing.
Awesome. So I know we primarily talked about like just a general like stream or watershed approach of the looking at the resources and the benefits of the ecosystem. How would this look like perhaps in maybe another kind of like environment, like say maybe an estuary or something? Just like in kind of like, would we look at like similar values, or would we possibly maybe look at other things?
So I was saying that we have ecosystem service studies in other places. So an example, the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia, and that was a great study. Again, it was an integrated team, but the goal would be to start with, you have a menu of services. So that case, it's a forested peatland, and there's all kinds of recreation, mitigation of fire. I'm trying to think through the other services, carbon sequestration, but done in a different way. So the goal is to have that menu and then work with folks that actually use and or manage. So we work with refuge staff and the local community to prioritize which services are valuable, and then essentially look at, okay, which ones are valued and then which ones are feasible. So some cultural heritage is an important one in Great Dismal Swamp, but it's one that's not well studied in terms of valuation. So starting with that and coming up with what's feasible. The approaches are pretty similar in terms of what's the actual valuation. But yeah, I think again, like an estuary, we're looking at one in Washington State, and looking at salmon fishing is really one of the most important. And carbon, we do look at carbon a lot, whether or not stakeholders are that excited about it. A lot of the work that we do is connected with the carbon science, so it's kind of just part of the whole system.
Great, awesome. We have a couple more questions here, which I think should fill up the rest of our time. From Ryan, which sorts of entities are best positioned to take this information and turn it into action? For example, could local, state, or governments, nonprofits?
Yeah, great question. And I would say, we're at this point in ecosystem services where it's like, we've been doing this for a while, developing methods, publishing, but there are not a lot of practitioners taking it and implementing it. And that's really the goal. So certainly local level, making decisions on let's restore this stream bank versus this stream bank, or conserve, this floodplain versus another floodplain. I think it could be very useful, and definitely nonprofit, from two different perspectives. Again, do we go get easements, and where do we get them? So really that targeting, as well as implementing payment for ecosystem service type of scenarios where they might, for example, some utilities may have, are you willing to pay $5 if your water quality is better? Those types of things. And communication, I think that's also critical, especially at the local level. Showing what those benefits are can help get buy-in from the community, for, again, payment for ecosystem service type of approaches, as well as just protecting the land itself.
All right. Laura asks, can you share more on the social cost of reducing CO2?
Yep. So there's an interagency working group on social cost of carbon dioxide reduction. And so there was a big emphasis, it was like 2013, I think, to about 2017. And they use these very sophisticated damage models with climate scenarios, and looking at, under different climate scenarios, what will happen to agricultural yields, property damage, health, about 5 different categories of how it would impact humans, and essentially came up with a projection of each year, if you have an additional ton of emissions or reduction in emissions, what would that value be to that future person, again, in terms of those damage categories. And so that was done, and then it was all rescinded in the last administration. And there's an effort now to redo it. So there was a 2020 memo that came out with that, about $51, and they're working again to update those numbers. And those are really focused on very real, quantifiable types of damages. Again, like you'd expect losses of agriculture and homes along the coast would be damaged, that type of thing. And those are a single value for basically the global population. So 1 ton, wherever it is either removed or added, is worth the same amount, and those damages would be considered a global amount.
Great. Well, thank you so much for answering our questions and for this amazing presentation. It was so informative. And so we thank you, and all of us thank you for taking your time out to be able to teach us all about this. So if there's not any more questions or anything, although did you want to share those links?
Yep. I will pop those in the link. Great.
Gotcha.
And I'll put my email in there as well if folks think of something later. Happy to answer questions.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for attending, and thank you, Emily, for being able to teach us all about this.
Great. Thank you so much.